Hi, everyone. We have a little bit of a different introduction today. My name is Keely Swan. I am the Assistant Director at the Center for Policy Research on Energy and the Environment that runs this Bradford seminar series. And today, our introduction is going to be given by Professor Elke Weber, who is actually on sabbatical in Germany, but she really wanted to join us, and so we found a way to kind of do this hybrid to make it work. So Elke, I will turn it over to you for the introduction now.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to introduce today's speaker. Veda Vaidyanathan is a multidisciplinary researcher who specializes in Asia-Africa interactions. Her PhD in African Studies is from the University of Mumbai in 2018. She is an associate at the Harvard University Asia Center and also a visiting associate fellow at the Institute of Chinese Studies in New Delhi. This is a comparative perspective, often examining Chinese and Indian engagements in Africa. For example, she examines investments in financial services and mining in Zimbabwe, agriculture in Zambia, infrastructure development in Tanzania and Kenya, and pharmaceutical manufacturing in Ethiopia. Veda is one of 5 Fung Global Fellows this year at Princeton, a program at Pierce that I just started to direct, and I'm delighted to welcome her to the C-PREE Bradford Speaker Series. Please take it away, Veda.
Thank you, Elke. Thank you, Elke, and thank you everyone for turning up. This is actually my first month in Princeton, so it's also my first talk post-COVID, like first in-person talk post-COVID. So if I suddenly ask you if I'm frozen or if you can hear me, it's it's a Zoom hangover. But it's such a pleasure to be here to be presenting my research so early on in my fellowship. So thank you to the center for having me. Thank you, Elke, for that introduction. Like Elke mentioned, I've had the fortune of studying Asia-Africa partnerships from multiple different vantage points. I was a doctoral fellow in India at Peking University, China, at the Harvard Yenching Institute. I was a researcher at a think tank in Delhi studying Africa, and I worked with African think tanks who study Asia based in Zimbabwe and Kenya. So just to sort of get this talk going, I found this quote by Jeffrey Sachs in on the new geopolitics in the Scientific American, and he says, each era has its own dominating themes of global politics. The 19th century had the politics of industrialization and empire. The first half of the 20th century bowed to world wars and economic depression. The second half was overshadowed by the Cold War. Our era, I believe, will be dominated by the geopolitics of sustainability. So to this effort to demystify the geopolitics of sustainability, as he puts it, my focus has been on analyzing granular interactions between Asian, largely Indian and Chinese actors with Africa. And the big question has been, how do these broader geopolitical exchanges play out on the ground? So like Elke mentioned, I've done a few different projects, independent projects in different countries. But a common thread of inquiry in my work has been case studies that explore what drives these Asian actors to Africa, what backward and forward linkages do subnational engagements create? How do they impact local ecosystems and communities? And at Princeton, my aim is to re-examine these insights and ask, what role can the subnational play in mobilizing green partnerships between Asia and Africa? So for today's talk, I'm going to initially provide an overview of Indian and Chinese engagement with Africa, just to sort of contextualize everything else that I'm going to say today. And why is this important to examine from a subnational or a sustainability lens? And then I'm going to take 3 case studies, 3 different kinds of subnational actors. One is a public interest environmental law group that I worked with in Zimbabwe. The second is an agricultural technology demonstration center, which is set up by a Chinese province in Lusaka in Zambia. And the third, a community-based grassroots organization based in India. I'll then quickly discuss some of my preliminary findings, and then we can have some time for Q&A. At this point, I just want to point out that although I'm just 4 weeks old in Princeton, one of the things that sort of struck me at my initial weeks here is how there's so much collaboration among people from different disciplines. So if anything I say today resonates with anything you do, please find me after the talk. So to begin with, India and China have had historical civilizational linkages with countries in Africa. When India became independent in 1947 and the PRC was established in 49, most countries in Africa were still under colonial rule. So from the late 40s to the end of the Cold War, the relationships were driven by the sense of Afro-Asian solidarity. The Bandung Conference in this relationship becomes important because it was a watershed moment for both India and China in their relationships with countries in Africa, and in the next few decades, they were driven by anti-colonial, anti-imperialist agendas. However, by the end of the Cold War, political solidarity sort of gave way to economic considerations. Today, India and China are the top 5 investors in Africa, and as you can see, their investments are diversified across sectors, across countries. India has extended concessional loans of over $12 billion and grant assistance over $700 million to Africa. They've built over 200 projects, from like drinking water programs to solar powers to transmission lines, sugar factories, and so on. China, between 2000 and 2019, has financed and signed over 1,000 loan commitments worth $150 billion to African governments and state-owned enterprises. Chinese lending to Africa peaked in 2013. The year when the Belt and Road Initiative was launched. And the top borrowers from Africa were Ghana, South Africa, Egypt, Cote d'Ivoire, and Nigeria. It's very interesting because according to the C-PREE database, which is the China Africa Research Institute based at Johns Hopkins, in 2000, there were only 3 Chinese lenders financing 14 projects that were worth $10 million. Today, there are over 30 Chinese lenders. These are commercial banks largely, and they have an incredible amount of sway across the continent today. There are many other factors too, which we can maybe talk about during the Q&A, like diaspora, for instance. India has a 3 million strong diaspora across East Africa and other parts of Africa as well. But the major driver, as you probably know, is the Asian countries, their access to natural resources in Africa. Nearly 61% of India's imports from the African Union are fuels, mostly crude from Nigeria, Angola, and Algeria, and also precious stones from Ghana, South Africa, and Botswana. But what China has been doing in the last 2 decades especially has gotten a lot of attention. Let's take the case of lithium. The table on the right, as you can see. There are countries like Congo, Mali, Zimbabwe, Namibia, which combined have established the African countries as high up there in lithium producers in the country. And as you can see, China largely controls a lot of the lithium offtake agreements in these different countries. Chrome, for instance, China is the #1 consumer of chrome. It accounts for roughly half of the global copper demand. A few Chinese companies control over 30% of African copper production and as much as 50% of the cobalt production through their strong position in the DRC and Zambia. However, 2000 is an important year. That's the year when the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation was established. And since then, their relationship with these countries have been very dramatic. So today, China is the largest trading partner, the biggest investor, major consumer of resources, and creditor for most African countries. Chinese FDI to Africa just in the 7 months of 2021 were over $2 billion. And bilateral trade, as you can see, grew from 10 billion in 2000 to 254 billion in 2021. Because of this dramatic rise of China's engagement in Africa, what's actually happened is that now there is an entire subfield of study within international affairs, to which I also belong, which looks at Chinese engagement closely in Africa. And so what sets it apart and why is this important to examine? So let's just look at one thing, infrastructure, right? So Africa's infrastructure gap is estimated to be anywhere between 130 million to 150 million. And why does this matter? This matters because the lack of transport, communications, energy infrastructure burdens African exporters with high input costs, high transport costs, expensive delays in reaching regional and global markets. Data from the Center for Global Development says that between 2007 and 2020, China's 2 main overseas development banks invested 23 billion in infrastructure projects on the continent, which is 8 billion more than other investors combined. Right? And this is actually very visible when you're traveling in different parts of Africa, in different countries. And let me just give you an anecdote. I was doing research in Bolkite in Ethiopia, and we had to take a bus up a hill. And suddenly the bus stops, and everybody gets out of the bus, no big deal, and they start walking up the hill, right? So then I ask a researcher who was with me, why are we walking up the hill? And he says, oh, you know, it's a Chinese-made bus. It cannot go up the hill with all of us in it. So we keep walking up the hill, go up the road, and there are these Chinese Mandarin signs on the way, which is a Chinese-made road. And then I asked them, you know, have things become easier since this road has come? And they said, yes, but you know, when the rainy season comes, the road sometimes gets washed away. So then I said, doesn't this annoy you that you have a bus that cannot go up a hill, a road that may or may not be there after the rainy season? And so they looked at me and they said, well, at least there's a road and a bus, right? So you can see Chinese signs in Addis, in Nairobi, in downtown Lusaka, it's everywhere. So Chinese construction companies, they've developed successful strategies that allow for high speed, enormous scale, low cost for infrastructure projects, and enjoy 30 to 60% of the market share, outpacing competitors. When I spoke to Chinese contractors in Tanzania and asked them and so we were doing a comparative study of a Chinese-built project that was funded by China Exim and a Chinese-built project funded by the World Bank. And we asked them, who are your big competitors in the market? And they said, other Chinese companies. So this is just an image I thought would sort of put this into perspective. So Chinese companies' engineering and construction projects in Africa totaled 38 billion in 2020. Africa made up almost 25% of global revenue for these companies. Algeria, Nigeria, Egypt, Kenya, and Ethiopia account for 45% of all Chinese companies' construction project gross revenues from Africa. And as you can see, from port projects to special economic zones and industrial parks to railway projects, it's all over. It's not just one area, it's across the continent. There's also, of course, ICT connectivity. The national ITC broadband cable that they're laying, that Huawei is laying across Tanzania, is something else that I studied, which has completely changed things on the ground. And they also have very interesting development cooperation models like the Luban workshop and vocational training centers. Again, just to give you a quick example, in the Copperbelt province in Zambia, when we went to one of the vocational centers, they said that, and it was very impressive. It looked new, the instruments looked new, and then they said that they tied up with a province in China, and then, they were tying up different vocational centers with different provinces, and they were getting teachers to come from China and teach, and so on and so forth. So why is this important to examine, right? It could be because I've only been studying this with blinders on, or it could also be because my family tell me I can be dramatic sometimes. But I really do think that this is one of the most crucial geopolitical developments in recent years. It's completely changing the game on the ground, and largely because what China is doing, by the different ways in which it's doing it, is providing African countries with alternatives, right? And this is challenging other actors in the region, including India. But again, all of what China is doing is obviously not positive. There's been tremendous pushback for Chinese actors. And just to sort of illustrate that, this is Michael Soy, whose work I was lucky enough to catch in Kenya. He has, and I recommend that you look it up later, but he has an entire series of paintings called China Loves Africa. And it's very satirical, and it's very, very critical of what China is doing in Kenya. That's Bright Aqua, a young artist in Ghana, who's also recently gotten into some controversy with the Chinese embassy in Ghana, very unhappy with his art and letting him know. But yeah, so there's been a lot of pushback. So how do ordinary Africans perceive China's engagement? And the best bet for this, to understand this, is Afrobarometer surveys. They've been surveying 34 countries, and the latest data from 2019-21 showed that Africans hold positive views of China's assistance and influence on the continent, though its perceived level of influence on African economies has waned over the past 5 years. China remains second to the United States as a preferred developmental model for Africans, and a majority of those who are aware of Chinese loans to their countries are concerned about being heavily indebted to China. Positive views of China's influence do not appear to affect African attitudes towards democracy. Again, another anecdote. In Zambia, when we were doing fieldwork, the driver who was taking me around, I asked him, what do you make of increased Chinese influence? And he went on this complete rant, and he said, oh, I don't like the Chinese. You Indians are okay because you bring Bollywood, but the China we're not okay with. He says all of this, and then when we get to the hotel where my Chinese colleague researcher is staying and we pick her up, she gets into the car, and I said, do you mind if she's with us? And he said, absolutely no, madam, welcome to Zambia. So it sort of goes to show you might not really like them, they might not be your favorite, but you need them. They're actually important partners. So then if the government-to-government interactions are so dynamic and interesting, then why do we have to look at subnational actors? This is just 2 lines from a paper written 22 years ago, and I still think it's relevant today. And he says, for the student of international relations, examining the roles and responsibilities of non-state actors in global environmental affairs is a departure from the ordinary concern of that field, namely the study of interstate behavior. Little is known about how local level institutions or ordinary citizens fit into global environment policy processes. So this is why I'm trying to look beyond the geopolitical dynamics and ask a few questions. 1, how do subnational actors weave narratives of sustainability into national policies? How can provincial governments and local stakeholders work together on transnational technology transfer initiatives? What happens when subnational actors find state support for scaling up innovative models? So to try and answer this, I'm going to present 3 different case studies today that work in 3 different sectors. 1 is mining, 1 is agriculture, 1 is renewable energy. The first is a Zimbabwe-based public interest environmental law group called ZELA, the Zimbabwe Environmental Law Association, and its research arm, the Africa Institute for Environmental Law. They're based in Harare, and they had a project examining the activities of Chinese-owned mines in gold, chrome, and diamonds, and their impact on local communities. Case study 2, China Aid, China-Zambia Agricultural Technology Demonstration Center, which is supervised by the government of Chilean province, operated by Chilean Agricultural University under the framework of Chinese Province Africa Country Cooperation Program. This project, the ATDC, it's one of 20 ATDCs in Africa, or over 20 ATDCs in Africa. It's kicked off by the Chinese government, but they stopped funding halfway through, and then now they're supported by various grants, including the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Case study 3 is a community-based grassroots organization in India called the Barefoot College. It's based in Rajasthan, a village called Talonia. And they work with rural African women to train them as solar engineers to electrify villages with solar energy. They are partially supported by the government of India. They also have other grants. So first case study. So the Zimbabwe Environmental Law Association is a natural resources governance organization in Zimbabwe and the Southern Africa region. Its work has evolved around promotion of environmental rights to broader natural resource governance agenda that includes natural resources such as land, water, wildlife, gas, and mineral resources. ZELA reached out to me in 2019. We very ambitiously wrote the proposal for it when we had no clue what a pandemic meant. And then we quickly realized that we couldn't, we had to sort of very quickly adapt. But then, so the project that was supposed to end in a year, it took us 2 to finish. But essentially what we did was look at the impact of Chinese investments in these 3 sectors and on local communities. This becomes important because Zimbabwe's mining sector is diversified with over 60 economic minerals that are mined in the country. It's an important part, it's an important economy. And if you look at Chinese investments, let's look at the first 2 investments, right? China, it's energy and then health. So China's investments from 2005 to 2020 is 12.82 billion in energy and 100 million in health. So clearly, it's a huge investor in the country. This is the team that put this together: Prolific, Eve, Farai, Mutuso, Obert, Josephine. So basically what we did was we did 2 rounds of focus group discussions in 8 different mining communities. We picked the interview sites after literature review and expert consultations. The first round, we had 77 participants. The second round, we had 163 participants. We made sure that every focus group discussion had local tribal chiefs, municipal councillors, local leadership, but also former mine workers who had worked in these Chinese mines, also members of the community. And every focus group discussion had a community health worker who initially presented, made sure that everyone wore face coverings and washed their hands and sat separately and all of that. We tried to reach out to Chinese mining company executives, and I think only in 2 discussions did they actually turn up. Another interesting thing was we didn't honestly expect so many people to show up, but when the village heard that there was a research team in town and they were asking these questions, a lot more people arrived than we had actually anticipated for. So what are some of the key takeaways? So this runs into pages, right, what the kind of feedback we've got from them. But I think I just want to highlight a few just to give you a sense of the kind of feedback we got. So on impact of environment, the community members stated that there's a visible footprint of open pits and unrehabilitated land. A number of cattle have died through falling in these pits. Air pollution, as heavy-duty trucks are driving through community roads and do not employ dust suppression measures. Communities indicated that the mining companies don't use abolition services and human waste is polluting local water bodies. In both Marange and Mohondogori, the communities also raised concerns over noise pollution resulting from the dynamites. In Marange especially, they said that because of the loud noises from explosions, houses, especially in Ward 30, were developing cracks. On labor relations, they said even before COVID-19, workers were not provided with safety clothing. Community leaders who approached some of the mining companies on this indicated that they were told that their workers are temporary and on a fixed contract basis, thus they cannot be buying safety gear every time a contract ends and a new worker has to come in. Another excuse was that the safety equipment was coming in from China and it takes a long time to ship it. At Golden Horn, it was alleged that some workers wore slippers to work, putting themselves at risk. Some of the women employed by Chinese mining companies, especially in Mohondogori, indicated that they were underpaid for the work they were doing. The women are paid $1 for a tonnage of chrome that they select and pack. They said a fair payment would be $5 per ton. In the local community, there were a lot of positive contributions. They said that Chinese companies contributed to community projects, provided water for tanks, assisted the local community with rehabilitation, improved infrastructure, employment generation, contribution to the resolution of the energy crisis with investments in hydro and solar projects. But in Marange and Mukwara communities, they indicated that a company had mined in an area called Banya, which is a graveyard for traditional leaders. The company had also cut down trees and mined at Zunde, which is a sacred wetland that is used by the community for their rain-making prayers. So they felt like a lot of their local traditions weren't being respected. They also mentioned that grazing land is limited as the pastures have been invaded, and that communities were not consulted about being displaced or even given an opportunity to deny or to accept. So what happened after we brought out the study, right? We brought out the study, we published the findings, we do dissemination events. So Zela conducted training workshops for key government officials, largely members of parliament, members of portfolio committees like the Committee on Environment, Climate Change, Trade and Investments, Security and Human Rights, informing them about the findings that we found and discussing ways to promote responsible investments. The trainings also included Jingjing Jiang. She's called the Erin Brockovich of China, if you've not heard of her. She's done excellent work, incredible work in China. So she brought on 2 of her colleagues, and they started informing the stakeholders about Chinese laws, Chinese regulations, and the Chinese companies investing abroad need to know. Zela was unable to gain access to ministers with lawmaking powers. So the parliament and Zela are currently working on an action plan to develop a petition and to present it to the ministers. After the study came out, they've also received several new grants to expand knowledge, to examine the impact of foreign investments in other sectors like lithium and coal, and map how to assist communities to access remedies. So what is the role of the subnational actor here? So one big win here is that Zimbabwe is currently looking again at the Environment Management Act. It is an existing piece of legislation that was brought in 2002, and they're trying to amend it. So now, because of the findings of the study, Zela has been asked to come on board and consult with members of the government, of the committee that's re-looking at it, and contribute their insights. Case study 2 is the Agricultural Technology Demonstration Center. This project also, we started at the ICS in 2019, ended in 2021. Thankfully, just before lockdowns, we were able to visit the campus in Zambia in Chongwei. So we visited the various labs, the various farms. We interviewed 2 out of the 5 Zambian experts, the Chinese director, and an official who received training from the ATDC. So there are several ATDCs, like I mentioned, across Africa, and largely they are 3 operational stages. One is the project construction stage. The Chinese government provides funds for the construction of the infrastructure for getting the agro equipment, and the host country provides the operational support like land, electricity, water. The second stage is the technical cooperation stage, where once the construction's over, the ATDC is transferred to the host government and becomes a state asset of the host country. A Chinese technical team will be assigned to the Center for Scientific Research, technique demonstration, technique training, extension of technology, and so on. And at this stage, the funding from the Chinese government ends. The third stage is the business operation stage. The center is expected to establish a market-oriented business model, and it needs to fund itself through some other income. In the case of the ATDC in Lusaka, they did this by the sale of maize, soybeans, cultivation of spawns of mushroom, renting machines to local farming communities, and lending technical services to other smallholder farmers. So how does the ATDC operate, and what is the impact on Zambian agriculture? So the center covers a total area of 120 hectares with facilities for administration, training, accommodation, experiment and demonstration, extension blocks, water reservoir, and so on. The Chinese government provided financial support for constructing the infrastructure and also for machinery like tractors, trailers, sprayers, planters. It cost $10 million to construct. It was completed in 2011 and handed over to the government of Zambia. The ATDC has 5 Zambians, 6 Chinese staff. Among the Chinese experts, all of whom are from Jilin Agricultural University. One is in charge of poultry, another of mushroom, and the others are responsible for managing purchases and handling finances of the firm, etc. The center's work is based on 4 pillars: scientific research, technique demonstration, technique training, and extension technology. This is the edible mushroom research center that they set up, and they hold demonstrations for local farmers regularly. So the ATDC has thus far examined 460 local varieties of crops, introduced and tested seeds of maize, wheat, and soybeans from Jilin, Sichuan, Yunnan, Guangdong, and other provinces. They have successfully cultivated 2 wheat varieties and 1 corn variety, which have been approved by the Zambian National Variety Registration Commission for commercial cultivation within the country. Until 2019, at the time when we had gone to visit, the ATDC had organized 59 workshops and trained 1,300 people. This largely involves also bureaucrats from the University of Zambia, from the Ministry of Agriculture. The center also allows students from the University of Zambia, the Copperbelt University, and the Natural Resources Development College to utilize the lab and provides them with internship opportunities. The demonstration plots for wheat, soybeans, maize, and mushroom, where experts led various training programs on how to use technologies, introduce tools, and farming techniques. So the Zambian experts working in the ATDC acknowledged its social impact and stated that ATDC contributed to the local farms in increasing incomes and provided a platform for learning from each other. Zambian farmers came to the program to learn new techniques that they later used in their businesses, and its effects are already visible with people selling different types of mushrooms in the markets. But they pointed out that language and cultural differences are a major challenge during technology transfer. Chinese teachers are unable to explain technical aspects precisely in English. They also talked about how the Chinese and the Zambian work ethic are very different, and that sometimes caused friction. And they also seem to be a lack of integration between the Chinese and the Zambian teams, and they appear to be working in separate silos. So what is the role of this subnational actor here? So the new technology learned at the demonstration center has led to a diversification of products sold in local markets and has possibly contributed to new sources of income for participating farmers. My last case study is a social work and research center called the or called the Barefoot College. It was founded by Sanjeet Bankur Roy in 1972 in a village called Tholonia in the state of Rajasthan in India. The college has demystified solar technology and is decentralizing its application by making it available to remote, non-electrified villages. The barefoot approach involves selecting unlettered women, bringing them on campus, training them for 6 months on how to fabricate, install, and maintain household solar electrification systems. This unique model is community-owned and managed, provides financial self-sufficiency, thereby empowering women. These barefoot women solar engineers install and repair these units for at least 5 years. They also set up a rural electric workshop in their own villages to store components and equipment needed for repair and maintenance of solar units. So I just finished the first phase of fieldwork in July 2022, and the center was just sort of recovering from the effects of the pandemic, which meant that they hadn't had people come in for training from different parts of the world. But they did have a batch of 15 women from different villages in Rajasthan. So I was able to sit down with them, have semi-structured interviews with each of them and talk to them individually, but also sort of sit in on these classes and see how does this technology transfer happen? Because a lot of these women hadn't been to school. One of them had been to middle school, and the other one had gone to first year of graduate school, but everyone else had not been inside of a school, a formal schooling structure. Oh, I have to mention, that's Leela. She is one of the oldest so basically they're called solar mamas. So she's one of the oldest solar mamas, and she had the most fantastic stories about how she doesn't speak very much. She doesn't speak a lot of English, but she traveled to Zanzibar and to different parts of Tanzania and Kenya and trained women in rural villages there, and also set up solar panels and solar farms there by herself. And she's a little bit of a rock star on campus. So the training has then been introduced to 36 countries in Africa, and over 560 solar mamas have been trained so far. The Barefoot College is working with the Government of India to construct 5 more regional vocational training centers in Liberia, Burkina Faso, Senegal, South Sudan, and Zanzibar. In 2019, the center in Madagascar was inaugurated, where 50 women from rural villages were trained, and they provided equipment to install solar panels. They expect that by 2030, 744 women will be certified solar engineers and will provide light to over 630,000 homes. So one of the things that I hope to do when I'm here is to ask this question: how effectively has the Barefoot College been able to transfer its Solar Mamas program from India to Africa? We're hoping to do follow-up interviews in Burkina Faso and Senegal later this year. So the first solar mama was selected in 2000. It took 20 years to prove that this model works, and it cost $15 million. So how do they actually teach this, right? So the beginning of the training, emphasis is made on making the trainees feel at ease with the process of solar electrification. They're introduced to different workshop terms, tools, components, and their uses. Then they learn the basics: how to use a multimeter, assembling components on a circuit, using tools correctly, and reading the value on a resistor. Introduced to lamps, charge controllers, and solar lanterns. Then, once they are familiar with the terms and the components, they learn to assemble a circuit, test a circuit, fabricate lamps and solar lanterns. There are exercises on setting up a rural electronic workshop, installing a home lighting system, and its repair. So learning by doing is the motto that the trainers there told me that they use. So they keep repeating and showing them how to do a particular task. It's a very non-structured environment. It's essentially like a very long room. And in between every solar mama, there is a master trainer. A master trainer is someone who has already undergone this training and has been sent abroad to do some of these projects. And then there's a main trainer at the head of the class who sort of teaches them. So far, over 1,700 solar mamas have been trained from 96 countries. 1,500 villages have been solar electrified, and 75,000 houses have benefited from this program. And they estimate that a total of 45 million liters of kerosene have been saved from polluting the environment. Here is Amisha. She dated someone to the anger of her conservative parents for 5 years, finally married him, and his mother and auntie brought her a day after the wedding for training for 6 months. So she wasn't too happy, but she was there with 2 people from other older generations, all undergoing training, all looking forward to going back and setting up rural workshops in their village. I just took a few snapshots from their manual to show you how actually the book looks like. So like you can see in the image below, they show you, okay, that's a brush, that's a tool, and then they show you how to use it. Everything, every part is color coded, so they know that this color goes in here, even if they might not know what it's called. And yeah. So the key takeaways. So they seem to prioritize villages where there's no electricity. A survey team goes in advance, and they set up an initial village team meeting where the villagers are told about the benefits of solar electrification. They're showed a PowerPoint presentation on a computer and so on. And if they express a need for solar lighting, a village environment energy committee is formed comprising of village elders. The village then must agree in writing to build or donate a building for the rural electric workshop and must identify volunteers from the village to undergo the solar engineers training. Every family must contribute a small fee to obtain lighting. Trainees are paid a small stipend, and according to the instructors, the dropout rates are almost nil, except if there is a family emergency. So what has been the impact? So a lot of these women are the first women in their families to step out and find work. The 15 students of this batch were from a traditionally deprived socioeconomic strata in Rajasthan. They talked at length about not being able to find a job or earn a living with respect. Most often, they resorted to daily labor in return for food. So when the survey team arrived at their villages, there was tremendous suspicion, but the fact that they were accompanied by a familiar local leader helped establish trust. They said they learned through codes with sign and basic English, which a lot of them said was daunting at first. More than 5 of them said they planned a very elaborate plan of running away from the camp after week 1, but did not follow through. After training, the women would be given assistance to set up the workshops and sell lamps at a nominal cost. This particular batch said would upend traditional social norms in their village because a lot of the people ideally wouldn't even interact with them otherwise. The master trainers said, who had been with the center for many years now, said they talked about social mobility. They talked about how their kids were now nurses and drivers. They talked about the respect that they have in their villages because these are the women who went out and brought light to the villages. They talked about the confidence and exposure. Almost all of them, one master trainer who is like a 55-year-old lady, she talked about how she went to Fiji and Samoa and set up solar panels there, and how in her imagination, she didn't think that the world was that big. So there's exposure. It introduces them to the world. And it's very interesting because a lot of these women have their kids with them at the training centers. So they tie like a little thing between the desk where infants sleep. Children are crawling around. So if the mother's busy, the trainers sort of pick up the kids. It's literally a village to take care of that child. And across from the building, there is a local school where, very informal again, a teacher sits and around him, children sit, and he talks about physics and biology and chemistry and all of that. So the children go to school, it's free. So there is no pressure to find someone to take care of your kids, right? And they said, especially the African trainees who come are very apprehensive at first because obviously everything is foreign. But with time, they said by the end of 6 months, friendships form, they celebrate everyone's festivals, and there's a lot of tears when a batch comes to an end. But the challenges, of course, have been for them that they're reliant excessively on grants. And the monitoring of centers in Africa, they said, is difficult. The enterprise model is working in Zanzibar, but they don't really know what's happening with the ground partners and other centers. Then the deployment of tools and grids are not quick. So these women have been trained for 6 months. There is a risk of them forgetting. The tools need to reach them quickly, but that doesn't happen. And also that equipments and parts are imported from China and assembled in India. They seem to have created an innovative solution to a pressing problem, and it seems to be some sort of a solution for a shared developmental challenge. So some preliminary findings from all of these different case studies is that they indicate that there are a plurality of actors that can inform the geopolitics of sustainability with local contexts. Sub-state actors can contribute by developing innovative approaches and business models, knowledge exchange, skills transfer, and transnational capacity building, driving change in technological and socioeconomic systems, informing national consultative processes, and providing networks to reach out to new or underrepresented constituencies. They also contribute by bridging local with the global, community leaders that are sources of indigenous knowledge systems, grassroots organizations that work with specific communities, provide insights that need to be taken into account while framing border policies. It's also important to catalyze and increase the visibility of actors in the margins of existing discourse on sustainability. So to conclude, the relationship between India, China, and countries in Africa rests on civilizational linkages, a shared history charged with anti-colonial reckoning, and is being shaped by geopolitical and economic interests. However, what drives an important part of this relationship are the plethora of subnational actors who are interacting with a pace, an intensity, and a complexity that is unprecedented. In the emerging geopolitics of sustainability, transparency, accountability, sharing knowledge systems, and finding grassroots solutions become crucial. To document and understand the genuine solutions put forth by some subnational actors may hold the key to addressing broader, bigger problems. Thank you.
Really interesting work. I'm just wondering, and you may not have done any work on this, if you have anything that you've observed or come across related to China's investment in renewable energy in Africa?
Subnational actors or?
Whatever you're familiar with.
Oh, what I know about that is China's I think it's the last 2 or 3 years, the most amount of investments have gone into renewable energy, into solar farms and hydro and wind and so on. So it is
What about solar and wind? Are you seeing an uptick in that? Or?
Yeah, absolutely. So they recently came out with a vision document, a China-Africa vision document for 2035. They used the word sustainability, if I'm not wrong, 7 or 8 times in that document, and they underscored the need for channeling more funds into solar and hydro and wind. Yes, please.
Thanks for the talk. It was super interesting and a ton of work. I'm curious if you have any experience, specifically about your Zambian case study.
Mm-hmm.
I'm curious what your thoughts are on how the Chinese agricultural universities and their relationship to the local Zambian officials and experts, how that relates to the American sort of version of that same type of thing. So like American agricultural universities who have projects in technical centers, places like Zambia. If you interacted at all with those groups, or if you have any thoughts on,
No, I haven't interacted with any American technical institutes. Like I said, blinders on. I've largely been looking at Indian, but that would actually be a very interesting case study. But I haven't looked at any. No. Yes.
Also, I know really fascinating talk and thanks for sharing the research. I actually had a follow-up on the same project. Do you notice with I think you mentioned one of your slides for that Agricultural Technology Development Center that they bring in varieties from China.
Yeah.
Was there any friction or any concern of replacing local varieties of those cultivars?
Yes and no. The Zambian officials that we interviewed, from the Ministry of Agriculture, they were very excited about the prospects because one of the biggest challenges facing the sector is low yield and low productivity. So any sort of out of the box thinking that could help address that problem was a welcome sort of thing. But when we did speak to a few, and I'm not too confident about this because my sample was very low, but when we did speak to some local community farmers, they seemed apprehensive about what that would mean. But I think it's also largely because they were competing with, in the market, when they brought their produce to the market, they were competing with other small stakeholder farmers who had been trained in these demonstration centers and had more output. So I think they were more, the competition was more there. But in terms of bringing in Chinese variety itself, I don't think. I think it was just seen as, if that'll help, then it's welcome. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks a lot also for really interesting talk. I have a question on the third case study.
Mm-hmm.
So first of all, the first question is, what is the actual primary goal of it? Because this challenge is targeting two issues, right? One is electrification, the other
Yeah.
one is empowering women.
Yeah.
Especially illiterate women.
Yeah.
And the interesting thing is, I think the first problem, and I do quite some work on electrification.
Okay.
And there's a really big shift since 2000, sort of, when they started.
Mm-hmm.
Because now solar home systems are really getting into the for-profit market.
Right.
10,000 of them being employed as we speak, right? So,
Right.
every year. And is that kind of undercutting the model of the center, because they're all, as you said, they're dependent on grants and stuff, but especially solar home system are really getting out of the grant sphere.
Yeah, absolutely.
How's that?
They actually brought that up as one of the challenges. Okay. Oh, yeah, they spoke specifically to that, how that once you try to make this a for-profit model, they are not going to be able to sustain in the market. So that is something that they're very worried about. But honestly, if I'm being very honest, I went in there to study the solar aspect of it, right? But by the time I finished talking to these 15 women, the women empowerment, of course I should have seen it coming, but I couldn't imagine the impact of it, right? So there was so much of that. So then it sort of sent me off on a tangent, and I just let them speak, because there were so many stories. So maybe a separate paper will come out of that, but for this study, it's largely about the solar aspect. And their dependence on grants and them not being able to compete in the open market are existential challenges to the center. Yes. Yeah. Yes.
Just one more bigger picture question. I really like at the beginning how you motivated this with geopolitics and sustainability.
Yeah.
And just curious, I think some of your conclusions highlighted this, but what would you say is especially unique about sustainability that really changes geopolitics in a way that traditional IR, like national security, this kind of stuff, doesn't really touch on?
Yeah, actually the first quote that I used, the Jeffrey Sachs quote, the entire article though, it's framed from that lens of war and how we need to get sustainability of resources from a very national strategic perspective. But the way that I see it, and because I'm trained in international affairs, right? So we were trained in the meta narratives at the beginning, right? So I was also in this whole India-China strategic competition or all of that in Africa. But the more time I spent in the field, I realized that so much of the interactions between these actors are happening at a sub-state level, right? And so if a Chinese company is going and investing in let's say, a rural village, a professor at Peking University, for instance, several professors, when they talk about China as the next superpower or China as a great power, a lot of their examples go back to what they're doing right in Africa, right? But then if you actually sort of zoom in on some of these projects, the ground realities are a little different. So then I started to think about how I need, as an IR person, instead of looking at this top down, I need to look at this bottom up and then sort of speak to the geopolitics of these interactions. And if you're going to question their sustainability, the questions need to come from the ground up. So that's kind of what influenced my work. But I wanted to start with that because I'm still, the lens is still geopolitics, but it's still of a micro story, if that makes sense. Make sense? Yeah. Yes.
I'm also thinking about the way that you framed the talk at the beginning, and one of the key comparisons that is often made between aid from the United States, development aid from the United States, and development aid from, particularly from China, is that Chinese aid is focused on infrastructure and development, and U.S. aid is focused on softer issues,
right.
Governance.
Right.
To what degree should we see these kinds of subnational interactions as being almost in the mode of U.S. type aid, as kind of like on the softer side, using
Yeah.
And to what degree is this really about a development and industrialization agenda, or should we maybe understand that a lot of the Chinese aid actually looks a lot like U.S. aid when you get down to the ground,
Mm.
and that like the mineral extraction stuff is the main thing that China's doing, and this is just kind of a side thing that looks like the U.S.
In the aid sphere, China is a new entrant. The US has done things for consistently so many more years in this region than China has. So that isn't something that I would compare. But what China defines as aid is different from what the US defines as aid, right? So for instance, the developmental architecture under which a lot of these Chinese projects fall could include traditionally what the US would include as aid. It could also include the standard gauge railway that China built from Kenya to Mombasa. But it isn't aid, but it could fall under the architecture of how the Chinese define aid. So it's interesting because these could appear like they are soft. Your words, not mine. Yeah, someone else's words, not ours. But these are just 3 case studies, and there are so many more, right? And if you look at, for instance, when something negative happens at this micro scale, the pushback that China gets on it, it's so much higher as well. So they could appear small and unimportant, but when they do come to there are many, many examples I could give, but when they do make it to the news and they make it to popular narrative, the Chinese government goes on overdrive trying to, so it's not really soft either, right? But I think, what I'm hoping to do the next year is try and study as many of these case studies as possible. And I'm hoping that at the end of it, I'll have a strong argument to make about how this is not soft, because this actually affects communities. And that, in turn, is going to affect the larger narrative. So it might not be as flashy as the hard stuff, but it's still important. Yes? Yeah.
Talk about the conflict between the Zambian and
The Chinese? Right.
about how to define forecast.
Mm. Oh, wow, that's a big question. Yeah. But to sort of zoom out of that case study, because work ethic is something, the Chinese work ethic is something that we hear about a lot, like across in Kenya, in Tanzania, in Zambia. And I think one of the older Kenyan officials, he had explained it to me once, and he said, what's really striking for us is that, again, when you compare how the Chinese do it versus, let's say, a Western organization or country, that they come in to build these huge infrastructure projects, but they stay in like containers, right? So I visited some of these project sites, which they've made it look really nice, but they're essentially just containers, right? That's where the senior managers stay, that's where all the technical teams stay, they all stay on site, right? And he was saying, at the same time, if we get like no offense to any of the French in the room, but if we get like a French company to build this, the consultant for the French company will only stay in the capital in Nairobi. We might have to get a helicopter to bring him to site, right? So what he says is, at nights, floodlights go on, different shifts of workers take over. So that's one of the ways in which they also finish projects quickly, right? So he was trying to tell me that this would never work with the laborers, workers from our country, because our work ethic is very different. Here, I think it meant that, in this case, the Zambian scientists were telling me that they were holding down academic positions at the University of Zambia and also working at this farm, so they obviously couldn't do the kind of research that their Chinese counterparts were doing. But this thing about Chinese work ethic being very industrial, very different. This is a common sort of a conversation. About friction and about race relations, it's murky. I mean, I'm sure you've read. There's a lot. A very good friend of mine, Runako Selina, just came out with a documentary for the BBC Africa Eye, and she explores this question, and I would encourage you to watch it. But there is incredible amount of xenophobia. There's an incredible amount of racism. I didn't include this here, but in a lot of our feedback, there are examples of ill treatment and just blatant racism. And what that goes into is, I think, a whole other conversation, the roots of that, I mean, but it is definitely a problem, and it's one of the problems that is causing a lot of pushback for local Chinese embassies, because they're constantly sort of fighting off these allegations and also sometimes defending them. So this is definitely a point of a conflict. The Indian thing becomes different, right? Because the Indians have been there much longer, especially in East Africa. So they're third, fourth generation Indians. So it's really interesting. So when I go to interview an Indian, let's say an investor, along with like my Ghanaian or Kenyan or Tanzanian researcher, they will look at them and other me, right? And say that us Africans, us Tanzanians, because they don't even identify as Indian anymore, right? But then interestingly, what they serve us would be chai and dhoklas and theplas, classic Indian food, right? So they're culturally Indian, but they don't identify as Indian. So so the Indians do assimilate, but they also don't, because a lot of these elite Indians that I spoke to, they don't marry outside of their Indian communities, right? Very few of them marry into local African communities. So there is no great assimilation in the Indian side either. But the Chinese are the new actors, right? The Indians, in comparison, are more familiar. So these race sort of issues comes up a little bit more there. Yeah.
So I think we'll have to end there.
Okay.
We're at time, but thank you all so much. And if you can stay a few minutes, perhaps.
Sure, of course, yeah, of course.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.